Every cathedral in Europe was built to do something nobody taught you in school, not to hold congregations, not to glorify a god, not even to intimidate peasants. They were built to heal the human body at a cellular level. The science was real. The results were documented. And then one institution decided the technology was too dangerous to leave in public hands. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Here is the story you were taught. Sometime around the 11th century, the Catholic Church decided it needed bigger, more impressive buildings. Stone replaced wood. Spires reached toward heaven. Stained glass filled walls with colour. And over the next 5 centuries, Europe built roughly 1,000 of these structures at an almost incomprehensible cost of human labour and time. Notre Dame de Paris took nearly 2 centuries to complete. Cologne Cathedral broke ground in 1248 and was not finished until 1880. But there is a problem with that story. The medieval peasant barely survived. His life expectancy hovered in the low 40s. His labour was owed to lords and church alike. He could not read. He owned almost nothing. And yet somehow he and thousands like him organised, hauled, carved and funded structures that still baffle modern engineers. We are asked to believe that the most economically brutalised population in Western history voluntarily financed the most expensive construction projects in Western history. For a church, most of them could not even enter on a normal day. That is not history. That is a story someone decided you should accept. Start with sound, because sound is where this story cracks open. Modern acoustic engineers who have studied Gothic cathedrals consistently report something with no easy explanation. The reverberation times inside these structures are not accidental. They are not a byproduct of building large rooms with hard surfaces. They are precisely calibrated. Salisbury Cathedral holds a reverberation time of roughly 6 to 7 seconds. Chartres runs between 5 and 8 seconds. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome reaches 10 to 14 seconds. In certain zones. These are not random numbers. Researchers in psychoacoustics have known for decades that human brain function changes measurably under specific sound conditions. Frequencies between 40 and 65 Hz, delivered at the right amplitude and reverb profile, suppress the prefrontal cortex and elevate activity in the limbic system. You stop calculating. You stop worrying. You enter what modern neuroscience calls theta wave dominance, the same state associated with deep meditation, accelerated healing, reduced cortisol and heightened immune response. Every major Gothic cathedral produces this effect naturally, through geometry alone. The height of the nave determines the fundamental resonant frequency. The width controls the harmonic overtones. The curvature of the apsidal end reflects standing waves back through the congregation. This is physics, not poetry. And here is the part the architectural history textbooks leave out. The dimensions used in Gothic construction follow ratios that appear in no other building tradition of that era. They do not come from Roman basilica plans, they do not emerge from military engineering, they come from a separate body of knowledge transmitted through guilds of stonemasons who operated under strict secrecy and who built structures with acoustic profiles that modern concert halls, equipped with computer modelling, still struggle to replicate intentionally. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Now, look up. The stained glass in a Gothic cathedral is not decoration. It never was. The colour filtering properties of medieval glass, particularly the cobalt blues and gold-infused reds used at Chartres and Sainte-Chapelle, produce a specific spectral output when sunlight passes through. The dominant wavelengths inside these buildings during midday hours fall between 430 and 490 nanometers on the blue spectrum, and between 620 and 700 nanometers on the red. Those are not arbitrary ranges. Blue spectrum light at those intensities activates the serotonergic system. Red spectrum light in the 670 nanometer range is now the basis of an entire medical industry called photobiomodulation, used clinically to accelerate tissue repair, reduce inflammation, and stimulate mitochondrial activity. The patients entering Gothic cathedrals in the 12th through 15th centuries were not metaphorically bathed in divine light. They were receiving wavelength-specific light therapy, delivered through glass formulated to exact compositions, oriented to catch specific solar angles at specific times of year. The orientation of virtually every major European cathedral follows the same pattern. The apse faces east, the main facade faces west. At sunrise, on the summer solstice and the equinoxes, the light entering through the rose windows hits the nave floor at angles that maximize coverage of the largest standing congregation. This required knowledge of solar astronomy that the Church officially declared dangerous when independent scholars attempted to publish it. The same institution that built the instruments controlled access to the explanation. A functioning cathedral in medieval Europe was not simply a place of worship. It was the most sophisticated medical facility within a radius of hundreds of miles. Pilgrims travelled weeks on foot to reach Chartres, Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, and Cologne. They came sick. They came with tumours, paralysis, infectious disease, with what we would now call autoimmune disorders. The Church kept records. The healing accounts at Chartres alone number in the thousands. The standard dismissal of these records is that they represent superstition. Credulous peasants who recovered for unrelated reasons and credited the Virgin Mary. But consider the economics. The pilgrimage infrastructure of medieval Europe was enormous. Hostels, roads, ferries, food markets, money changers, relic sellers, guide services. Entire regional economies ran on pilgrimage traffic. The Church collected fees for proximity to relics, fees for candles, fees for masses said on a petitioner's behalf. A productive healing site was a revenue engine of the first order. Productive healing sites required repeat traffic, verifiable results. If the healing accounts were entirely fabricated, the pilgrimage economy collapses. People do not walk from Germany to France on the testimony of lies. They walk because someone they trusted came back better. The economic logic of the pilgrimage system only functions if a meaningful percentage of pilgrims experience genuine physiological improvement. The cathedrals were the hospitals of the medieval world, and they were extraordinarily well-funded hospitals because the institution controlling them had perfected a model that modern healthcare has not improved upon. The patient pays, the patient heals, the patient tells others, others pay to enter. The building does the therapeutic work, the operating costs are mostly wax and music. That is a better model than anything currently running in the insurance industry. The tradition behind cathedral construction is called sacred geometry. It is taught today as a mystical curiosity, decorative numerology for people who find meaning in spirals. That framing is deliberate. Sacred geometry, as practiced by the operative Masonic lodges of the 12th through 15th centuries, was applied biophysics. The proportional systems used, based on the golden ratio and specific integer ratios derived from musical harmony theory, produce buildings with measurable psychophysiological effects on occupants. The knowledge was encoded in stone rather than written down for one reason. Stone cannot be burned. You cannot confiscate a cathedral. The people who held this knowledge were the travelling stonemason guilds, precursors to what later became Freemasonry. They moved between commissions carrying knowledge the institutional church tolerated as long as it remained the primary customer, and suppressed viciously the moment independent practitioners attempted to apply it outside church authority. Giordano Bruno, who lectured across Europe on cosmological systems rooted in sacred proportion and universal healing principles, was arrested by the Inquisition. After 8 years of imprisonment, he was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600. The pattern is consistent. Anyone who attempted to extract the operative knowledge from its institutional container and make it widely available was not discouraged. They were destroyed. The Reformation is taught as a theological dispute, Luther versus the Pope. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The Reformation was also the moment the healing architecture tradition effectively ended. Protestant iconoclasm destroyed the stained glass in hundreds of northern European churches. Clear glass replaced the chromatic filters. The acoustic properties of medieval interiors were disrupted by inserted gallery floors, wooden pews, and secondary platforms that broke the resonant geometry of the nave. Calvinist and Lutheran theology explicitly condemned the idea that a physical space could mediate between the human body and the divine. The building became irrelevant except as a shelter for the congregation. The sacred was relocated entirely into scripture and interior conscience. This was framed as liberation from superstition, and in some ways it genuinely was liberation from fraud, from the corruption of indulgences, from the grotesque financial extraction of the late medieval church. But it also eliminated the therapeutic technology. Within 2 generations of the Reformation in Northern Europe, the pilgrimage economy collapsed. The roads that had sustained hostels, markets, and transportation networks for centuries emptied out. Regional economies dependent on healing traffic crashed. The knowledge of why the buildings worked dissolved because the people who held it were converted, dispersed, or killed. The knowledge went underground, into private lodges, into coded architectural manuals, into esoteric traditions the 18th century Enlightenment would alternately ridicule and secretly study. But the public delivery mechanism, the great open healing spaces that any person could walk into, was gone. The replacement for the cathedral economy arrived in the 19th century. It was called the hospital. The hospital model took the therapeutic function that had been delivered collectively, architecturally, and effectively for free, and rebuilt it as an individual fee-based, chemically mediated transaction. You were no longer healed by a space. You were treated by a specialist with substances in a room designed for infection control rather than psychophysiological optimization. The economics flipped entirely. A cathedral amortizes its construction cost over centuries and then delivers therapy powered by sunlight and physics. A hospital requires continuous capital investment, continuous staffing, continuous pharmaceutical supply chains, and continuous payment extraction. One model generates revenue indefinitely from a one-time infrastructure investment. The other requires constant feeding. The second model became the basis of the modern healthcare economy, which is now one of the largest sectors of GDP in every developed nation. This is not a conspiracy. It is an economic logic. Institutions protect revenue models. The modern pharmaceutical and hospital industry protects its treatment-based model through regulatory capture, insurance architecture, and the funding of research programs that structurally cannot investigate non-chemical therapeutic modalities. The acoustic properties of Gothic cathedrals have been studied by roughly 40 researchers worldwide in the last 30 years. Photobiomodulation, using the wavelength profiles naturally produced by medieval stained glass, remains outside standard care protocols of every major healthcare system, despite a growing body of peer-reviewed clinical literature. The knowledge still exists. The buildings still exist. In many cases, they still work exactly as designed for anyone willing to sit in them long enough to let the physics happen. They just stop telling people that is what they are for. The cathedrals are still standing. The light still filters through the same glass. The sound still reverberates off the same stone. The healing technology was never destroyed. It was reclassified, renamed, dismissed as architecture instead of medicine. What was common knowledge became esoteric, then forgotten. The machine still runs, the instructions are buried, and somehow that turned out to be the most profitable thing anyone ever did with a building.